1. Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is one of history's most infamous unidentified serial killers. Operating in the Whitechapel district of London in 1888, he murdered and mutilated at least 5 women, most of whom were sex workers. What made his crimes particularly shocking was the gruesome nature of the killings. Victims were often found with their throats slit and organs removed. The name Jack the Ripper came from letters sent to the police allegedly written by the killer himself, taunting their inability to catch him. These letters added to the fear and sensationalism surrounding the case. However, many historians believe these letters were hoaxes, written to gain attention. Jack the Ripper's murders occurred during a time of significant social and economic turmoil in London. The East End, where the killings took place, was overcrowded and impoverished, making it a fertile ground for crime. Despite widespread public outrage and intense police investigations, the killer was never caught. The enduring fascination with Jack the Ripper stems from the combination of his brutal crimes, the lack of resolution, and the societal context in which they occurred. It's a chilling reminder of how fear and violence can grip a community and leave an indelible mark on history. 2. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was a charismatic and intelligent serial killer who murdered at least 30 young women in the 1970s, though the true number may be higher. Bundy's charm and good looks allowed him to manipulate and lure victims into his trap. He often feigned injury, using a sling or crutches to gain their trust before abducting them. Bundy's crimes were particularly horrifying due to the brutality of his attacks. He bludgeoned, strangled, and even decapitated victims, keeping their remains as trophies. Despite being captured multiple times, Bundy managed to escape custody twice, further adding to his notoriety. What makes Bundy's case so infamous is how ordinary he seemed. He was educated, ambitious, and even worked on a suicide prevention hotline. This juxtaposition between his outward appearance and his horrific crimes shocked the public. Bundy's trial was one of the first to be televised, turning it into a media spectacle. His articulate demeanor and self-presentation in court fascinated and horrified audiences. Ultimately, he was convicted and executed in 1989, leaving behind a legacy of horror.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
3. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys, often engaging in acts of necrophilia, cannibalism, and dismemberment. Dahmer's crimes were deeply disturbing because of the meticulous way he carried them out. He would lure victims to his apartment, drug them, and then kill them. Dahmer often kept body parts as trophies, reflecting his obsession with control and possession. What's particularly haunting about Dahmer is that many warning signs were ignored. He was arrested multiple times for minor offenses, but authorities failed to connect him to the disappearances of his victims. Dahmer's case raises important questions about mental health, policing, and societal indifference. Although he expressed remorse after capture, his actions remain a chilling example of unimaginable darkness. 4. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, was a seemingly ordinary man who committed horrific crimes. Gacy was a respected community member, even performing as a clown at children's parties. However, between 1972 and 1978, he murdered at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy lured victims to his home under the guise of offering work or friendship. Once there, he would handcuff, torture, and strangle them. Most of his victims were buried in the crawl space beneath his house, horrifying investigators. What made Gacy particularly terrifying was his ability to lead a double life. He was a community leader while secretly committing unspeakable acts. Gacy was convicted and executed in 1994. His case highlights the dangers of appearances and serves as a stark reminder of hidden human complexities. 5. H. Holmes. H. Holmes is often called America's first documented serial killer. During the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, Holmes lured victims to his infamous Murder Castle, a building designed with hidden rooms and gas chambers. Holmes used charm and intelligence to prey on vulnerable individuals, particularly women. After killing his victims, he would sometimes sell their skeletons to medical schools, profiting from his crimes. What makes Holmes's story chilling is the calculated nature of his actions. The Murder Castle was a horrifying example of premeditated evil designed solely for murder. He said, Holmes's case is a testament to how manipulation and planning can be wielded for sinister purposes. His story continues to fascinate as a symbol of cold, calculated cruelty. 6. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, terrorized Los Angeles and San Francisco in the mid-1980s. Over 14 months, Ramirez committed a series of home invasions, rapes, and murders. Not once had Ramirez been seen seated on a house in San Francisco called It Is the End. Ramirez's crimes were terrifying due to their randomness. He targeted people of all ages, genders, and backgrounds, entering homes through unlocked windows or doors. Ramirez's fascination with Satanism added another layer of horror. He left pentagrams at crime scenes and professed allegiance to Satan, intensifying public fear. Befrag lupi libet. Here, said Boris. What made Ramirez's capture unique was the role of the community. Residents recognized him after his picture was circulated and detained him until police arrived. Ramirez's case underscores the importance of community vigilance and serves as a chilling reminder of the unpredictability of violence and fear. 7. Ed Gein. Ed Gein, known as the Butcher of Plainfield, committed crimes in the 1950s that shocked the world and inspired fictional characters like Norman Bates, The Silence of the Lambs. Although Gein was convicted of only 2 murders, the bizarre and horrifying details of his actions cemented his infamy. Gein lived a secluded life in rural Wisconsin under the heavy influence of his strict, domineering mother, Augusta. She instilled in him a deep fear of women, teaching that they were sinful and corrupt. After her death, Gein became increasingly isolated and spiraled into madness. Gein confessed to robbing graves to collect body parts, which he used to create macabre items like lampshades and a suit made of human skin. These objects, found in his home, horrified investigators and the public. Gein's case highlights the devastating impact of isolation, psychological abuse, and untreated mental illness. His crimes shocked a nation and left a lasting legacy in popular culture, serving as a cautionary tale. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos, nicknamed the Monster, is one of the most infamous female serial killers. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos murdered 7 men in Florida, claiming self-defense against sexual assault, as she worked as a sex worker at the time. Wuornos's troubled childhood was marked by abandonment, abuse, and neglect. Early homelessness and exploitation likely contributed to her psychological state. By her killing spree, she had a history of criminal behavior and instability. Her killings involved shooting victims at close range, and her justification of self-defense became a focal point of her trial. Wuornos's case sparked debates about abuse, sex work, and criminal behavior. She was convicted and executed in 2002. Wuornos' story is a tragic example of how early trauma and systemic failures can shape a person's life. While her actions were heinous, her story highlights the need to address abuse and inequality. 9. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, also known as the Gray Man or the Brooklyn Vampire, is one of the most disturbing figures in criminal history. Active in the early 20th century, Fish preyed on children, engaging in sadism, torture, and cannibalism. Fish's behavior was rooted in severe mental illness, including masochistic tendencies and psychotic delusions. He claimed to hear voices and believed he was commanded by God to commit crimes. Fish often lured children with promises of jobs or treats before torturing and killing them. One infamous crime was the murder of Grace Budd, after which he wrote a chilling letter to her family detailing how he cooked and ate parts of her body. This letter ultimately led to his capture. Albert Fish's case is a reminder of the depths of human depravity and the consequences of untreated mental illness. His actions remain an example of extreme psychopathy. 10. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who murdered at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990. His crimes involved stabbing, mutilation, and cannibalism. Chikatilo's early life was marked by trauma and hardship. Growing up during the Soviet famine, he faced starvation, abuse, and humiliation, which contributed to his later violence. As an adult, he struggled with sexual dysfunction, finding gratification only through violence. Chikatilo evaded capture for years due to flaws in the Soviet investigative system. He was finally arrested after being observed acting suspiciously, and DNA evidence linked him to several murders. Chikatilo's case underscores the importance of robust investigations and psychological profiling. It highlights how unresolved trauma and systemic failures can allow atrocities to persist. 11. Pedro Alonso López. Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes, is one of the most prolific serial killers, claiming to have murdered over 300 young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the 1970s. His victims were often poor, vulnerable children, lured with promises of gifts or food. López's early life was marked by severe abuse and neglect, including sexual violence. His victims' marginalized status allowed his crimes to go unnoticed for years, exposing societal neglect. López was caught in Ecuador in 1980 after a failed abduction. He led authorities to many victims' graves. But, due to legal limitations, he served just 14 years and was released. His current whereabouts are unknown. López's case raises questions about justice, accountability, and protecting marginalized communities. It underscores the need for systemic reforms to safeguard the vulnerable. 12. Dennis Rader. BTK killer. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, bind, torture, kill, terrorized Wichita, Kansas between 1974 and 1991, murdering 10 people. Rader meticulously planned his crimes and taunted law enforcement with letters describing his killings. Rader appeared to be an ordinary family man working as a compliance officer and serving as a church leader. This facade made his crimes even more shocking upon his 2005 arrest. Rader's ability to blend into society and his meticulous nature helped him evade capture for decades. His case highlights the dangers of underestimating seemingly ordinary people and the importance of investigative persistence. 13. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway, infamously known as the Green River Killer, is one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Active from the 1980s to the early 2000s, Ridgway murdered at least 49 women, though he later confessed to killing more than 70. His victims were predominantly young women and teenagers, many of whom were sex workers or runaways, making them vulnerable targets. Ridgway earned his moniker because many of his victims' bodies were discovered along the Green River in Washington state. He lured his victims by pretending to be a client, gaining their trust before attacking them. After killing his victims, Ridgway often disposed of their bodies in remote wooded areas, returning later to perform disturbing acts with the corpses. Ridgway managed to evade capture for decades, largely because he led a seemingly normal life. He was married, employed as a truck painter, and described by acquaintances as quiet and unassuming. This facade of normalcy allowed him to continue his crimes without arousing suspicion. His eventual capture in 2001 was due to advances in DNA technology. Investigators linked DNA from several crime scenes to Ridgway, leading to his arrest. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Ridgway cooperated with authorities to locate additional victims, helping provide closure to some grieving families. Ridgway's case is significant not only for the scale of his crimes, but also for the societal implications. It underscored the vulnerability of marginalized populations and the need for better protection and advocacy for those at risk. It also highlighted the importance of forensic science in solving long-standing cases. 14. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Báthory, often referred to as the Blood Countess, is one of history's most infamous female killers. A Hungarian noblewoman from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Báthory is accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young girls, earning her a reputation as one of history's most prolific murderers. According to legend, Báthory believed that bathing in the blood of virgins would preserve her youth and beauty. She lured young girls to her castle under the pretense of offering them work or education. Once there, they were subjected to horrific acts of torture, including beatings, mutilation, and even death. While some details of her crimes are shrouded in myth, there is ample historical evidence to suggest she committed heinous acts. Servants who worked for her were complicit in the crimes and later testified against her. Báthory's reign of terror ended when she was arrested in 1610. Due to her noble status, she was never formally tried or executed. Instead, she was imprisoned in her castle, where she died in 1614. Báthory's case has sparked a debate among historians. Some argue that the allegations were exaggerated or politically motivated, as powerful figures sought to seize her wealth and land. Others believe her crimes reflect the unchecked power and privilege of the aristocracy. Regardless of the extent of her guilt, Elizabeth Báthory's story remains a chilling example of how power can corrupt. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unrestrained authority and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Nana Ileoni, writing during the Second World War, described the self-imposed captivity of Elizabeth as its test. 15. Charles Manson. Charles Manson is infamous not for the murders he personally committed, but for the brutal killings carried out by his followers, known as the Manson family. In 1969, under Manson's direction, his followers committed a series of murders, including the high-profile killing of actress Sharon Tate and her friends. Tate was 8 months pregnant at the time of her death, making the crime particularly horrifying. Manson was a charismatic and manipulative leader who gathered a group of young, impressionable followers in the late 1960s. Using a mix of charm, apocalyptic ideology, and psychological control, he convinced his family to commit murders that he believed would incite a race war, which he called Helter Skelter, inspired by a misinterpretation of a Beatles song. Strangely enough, many people actually believed the stories. His best, the murders shocked the world not only because of their brutality, but also because they symbolize the dark side of the countercultural movement of the 1960s. Manson exploited the vulnerability of his followers, many of whom were disillusioned youth searching for meaning. Manson and several of his followers were arrested and convicted in 1971. Manson received a death sentence, later commuted to life imprisonment after California abolished the death penalty. He died in prison in 2017, but his legacy endures as a symbol of manipulation and the capacity for evil in the guise of idealism. The Manson family murders remind us of the power of influence and the dangers of blind devotion. They underscore the importance of critical thinking and the need to question authority, especially when it leads to harm.